Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policies Editor-in-Chief. It is time for our regular AMA episode. We have got tons of questions from all of you all over the world. And if you've joined in and haven't asked one yet, we are still taking questions. You know where to click. We mentioned this in the blurb for this episode, but I just got back from a couple of weeks in India and China. I go to India often, but for a variety of reasons, I actually haven't been to China in quite a while. So I'm going to share some of my observations from there, but of course, I mostly want to take your questions. So let's dive straight in. Time to hand the mic over to our executive producer, Donna Shern. Donna, over to you.
Thanks, Ravi. Let me tell you, we got so many questions this time. I'm excited to put them to you. We won't be able to get through them all, but as Ravi said, please keep sending them in. We'll take a look. And thank you to everyone who sent in their queries and thoughts. As you said, you're a regular in India, Ravi, but you haven't been to China in, was it years?
Several
What was
years.
your, so, okay, great. Yeah. What was your big takeaway?
So, I mean, and I should preface this by saying, I mean, I know many of our listeners and viewers are actually frequent China visitors, so some of this might sound trite, but I hadn't been for close to a decade for a variety of reasons, partly the pandemic. But if I had to list out some takeaways, especially with that distance between visits, a few things stood out to me. I mean, one is China's really gone cashless. And it's one thing to use that word, it's another thing to see it in action. I mean, your Amex and Visa cards don't work as much. No one really takes cash. You kind of have to download Alipay, Didi, and use that to get around, use that for basic transactions. It really hits you as you try to just get through a regular day there. That struck me as a big change in the last decade or so. EVs, the sheer number of EVs on the streets of Beijing is something to behold. I mean, you see the green number plates, and really, it's something like 10% of all cars in China now are electric. Some 50% of all car sales in the last year are electric. The movement towards EVs is truly stunning to behold. It's one thing to know the statistics, quite another thing to see it in action. And these are really cool cars as well, the BYD ones, the Show Me SU7. But then lastly, Donna, clean air. I had just come from India and I went to China, and the distinction is stark, both between India and China, but also between China today and China a decade ago. About a decade ago, you could almost like taste the air. It was metallic. You could see the smog everywhere. It made you wheeze. A lot of that is gone, and I'm sure it's linked in part to this massive boom in EVs, but also solar and wind energy.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, one of your messages from there, you wrote that it was like a visit to the future, which I can see why. Um, Speaking of all those advances in technology um, and electric vehicles, I'm wondering if China can help other countries with those kinds of similar advances made on clean energy. One of our subscribers, named Benita, asked about the role of export restrictions in those advancements.
Yeah, this came up a lot when I was in Beijing and speaking to officials there, speaking to thinkers and journalists as well. Just to turn to the numbers for a second, they're truly mind-blowing. So between January and May of this year, China's added something like 240 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity, and that is basically as much electricity as Indonesia or Turkey produces
Wow.
overall by all sources. In May alone, China installed as much solar and wind capacity as all of Poland or all of Sweden or all of the UAE produce from all sources. I mean, so we're talking about big stuff that China's doing. It really has transformed its sort of energy sources. And the numbers are mind-boggling. But in terms of what it is actually giving the world, the changes there are also big. I mean, China alone is contributing to like a 1 percentage point reduction in CO2 emissions for countries around the world, but mostly in the global south. what struck me, Dana, is that could be accelerated significantly. And there are export controls on the latest wind and solar advances. There are also export controls on rare earths, certain types of them that are crucial for magnets that go into the production of solar panels or the very best wind technology. And some of that is because China sees its advances in clean energy as a national security issue. Some of it is also retaliatory, targeting the United States in particular because of the ongoing trade war. So, if you are of the stance that of all the problems the world faces, especially in the next couple of decades, if you're of the stance that the biggest of them is the climate crisis, then you can't help but look at China and think they've kind of begun to figure this out for themselves.
Mm.
What would it take for them to share all of that with the rest of the world and specifically the global south? And I'm talking here about India, Nigeria, big countries with big populations that are going to see their emissions boom over the next few decades.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, another thing I'm thinking about here is the way AI requires such enormous amounts of energy, right? Which is something we've talked a lot about. And it sounds like that's probably part of this calculation as well. Um,
Yeah.
and speaking of all these calculations that are being made, I know you spoke to some senior Chinese officials. If you want to tell us who they are, we'd love to hear. But did Trump come up much? How are they thinking about him? This one's a question from a lot of our subscribers. I'll name just Maju Parit, among others.
Yeah, hi Maju. This came up every single time. So I was quite lucky. I got to speak to quite a few Chinese officials. I can't name them here, but this was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also a couple of other departments. Also spoke with a lot of local ambassadors. Trump came up all the time. This was partly them wanting to understand how Trump thinks. And this is because I live in the United States. I come from an American magazine. So there was a bit of intelligence sharing there, but mostly I was curious how they perceive Trump. And, one thing that came up a fair bit is they see him as volatile. They see him as creating a lot of opportunities for them, specifically for China in terms of the alliances that are fraying for the United States. How can China take advantage of that? Certainly in the clean energy space, soft power as well. If America's losing soft power, what does China have to gain? If other countries are feeling like they can't rely on the United States, what does China have to gain? But there was one other element of this that came up a few times, a level of disbelief. There's this sense that's so deeply entrenched in China that, America is this big superpower. It's still the number one country by most metrics. And there's a sense of disbelief that, how could they be doing what they're doing? And surely there's some larger grand strategy attached to what seems to be policies that are volatile, chaotic, jumping from one thing to another, one day to the next. They kept mentioning taco and saying, where is this going to settle? Surely there's a bigger grand strategy at play. So that was very interesting because the Chinese, they don't want to buy into this sort of facile theory that Trump isn't smart. They actually see him as someone who is a tough negotiator, who, while seemingly on the face of it, might be hurting some American interests. They refuse to think of it as black and white as that, and they are assuming that he's acting in American interests at some level. And of course, Trump did introduce tougher policies on China, and that is something they will not forget, of course.
And a reminder to our viewers here, Taco, Trump always chickens out. You have used tap, Trump always pivots. This is a good segue, though, this reaction to Trump's policies, to a question from Al Van Veen. He wants to know how other bilateral relations are developing in this context. Is China's leadership working to improve relations with other Asian countries, especially ones I'm thinking of like the Philippines that has traditional ties to the US?
Yeah, this is a big theme for China, and I think they've been working on it at some level for quite a while. China's become the largest trading partner for most Southeast Asian countries. You can think of the RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's a free trade agreement between 10 ASEAN member states plus a few others, China, Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand. Think of the BRI, that's the Belt and Road Initiative. You add all of those up with some of the more political organizations. There's ASEAN plus three, as it's known, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and China's clearly thinking about how it can improve relations with other Asian countries, how it can sort of use changes in leadership. So Japan has a relatively new leader. South Korea has a new president, how they can sort of try and make sure that these new leaders prioritize China as they come to power, as they think about balancing relations amid US-China tensions. So that was also a big theme, I think, that emerged from what I could tell among Chinese leaders, that they're very keen to take advantage of the moment. And then there's India, of course, which we could discuss separately, I guess. But, there's been a thaw in relations there. And one has to assume that some of that is because of US-India tensions that are beginning to emerge now.